The blizzard hit like God's own fury, turning the world into nothing but white chaos and screaming wind. Grace Hammond pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine tree, her frozen fingers clutching her medical bag, like it was the only solid thing left in creation. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except the bone-deep cold that had seeped through every layer of her wool dress, and the borrowed coat that wasn't nearly heavy enough for Wyoming territory in deep winter. Her father had warned her not to make the house call alone. "Mrs. Peterson's baby was coming early," he'd said, "but the storm was coming faster. Send someone else. Anyone else." But Grace was 28 years old, and she'd been helping her father deliver babies since she was 16. And she wasn't about to let a woman and child die just because the weather turned mean. That was 2 hours ago, before the wind picked up to a howl that drowned out thought. Before the snow started falling so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Before her horse spooked at a branch cracking under the weight of ice and bolted, leaving her stranded 3 miles from Stone Valley, with darkness coming on fast, and the temperature dropping like a stone into a well. She was going to die out here. The thought came calm and certain, almost peaceful in its inevitability. They'd find her in the spring thaw, frozen solid, still clutching her father's medical bag. Luther Cross would probably give a nice eulogy at her funeral, talk about what a waste it was, how she should have accepted his proposal and stayed safe at home like a proper woman. The thought made her angry enough to push away from the tree and stumble forward another few steps. She'd rather freeze to death than give Luther Cross the satisfaction of being right about anything. The snow was knee-deep now, each step a battle against the drifts and the wind that wanted to knock her flat. Her breath came in gasps that burned her lungs with cold. Ice had formed on her eyelashes, making it hard to blink. She didn't know which direction she was going anymore. Didn't know if she was walking toward Stone Valley or away from it. The world was just white and cold, and the growing certainty that she wasn't going to make it home. Then she heard it. A sound that cut through the wind like a knife through silk. A horse's whinny, strong and close. Hope surged in her chest, so fierce it hurt worse than the cold. She tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper, her throat raw from breathing frozen air. She stumbled forward, following the sound, and then suddenly there was a shape in the whiteout. Dark and solid and real. A horse. A massive bay horse, and on its back, a man. Grace's frozen brain took a moment to process what she was seeing. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, sitting the horse like he'd been born in the saddle. He wore heavy furs and dark leather, his long hair whipping in the wind. Even through the snow and her blurred vision, she recognized him. William, the tracker, the half-Shoshone man who lived on the edge of Stone Valley, who everyone whispered about, but no one really knew. The man Luther Cross called a savage and told her to stay away from. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion that made it look easy despite the storm. And suddenly, he was there in front of her, his dark eyes taking in her frozen state with an expression she couldn't read. His face was all hard angles and copper skin, beautiful in a way that made her chest tight even through her terror. He didn't ask if she was all right. Didn't waste time with questions she couldn't answer through chattering teeth. He just moved, efficient and sure, pulling off his own heavy fur coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The sudden warmth was almost painful, and she gasped, the sound lost in the wind. The coat smelled like leather and smoke and something wild she couldn't name. It smelled like safety. William said something she couldn't hear over the wind. Then, before she could process what was happening, his hands were on her waist. Large hands, strong and sure through the layers of fabric, spanning her ribcage like she weighed nothing at all. Grace gasped, the sound half shock and half something else entirely, as he lifted her up toward his horse with a strength that should have terrified her, but instead made her feel safer than she had in hours. His hands were warm even through her frozen clothes, solid and real and alive. And the way they held her, careful but firm, sent something jolting through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She'd never been handled like that, like she was both precious and capable of being protected. Luther's touches were always possessive, controlling. Her father's were clinical and distant. But this was different. This made her aware of her body in a way that heated her from the inside despite the killing cold. He swung up behind her in one smooth motion, his arm coming around her waist to pull her back against his chest. And Grace's breath caught again for entirely different reasons. He was solid as a mountain behind her, all muscle and warmth. One arm holding her secure while his other hand took the reins. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back, could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, could feel every shift of his body as he guided his horse forward into the storm. This close, wrapped in his coat and held in his arms, she wasn't cold anymore. She was burning up, aware of every point where their bodies touched, every place his arm pressed against her waist, every breath that stirred her hair. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she knew he could probably feel it, knew he had to notice the way she'd stopped shivering from cold and started trembling from something else entirely. William didn't say anything, just urged his horse forward with his knees, leaning low over her to shield her from the worst of the wind. His hair fell forward, brushing against her cheek, and Grace closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, letting herself be held and protected and saved by this man she barely knew. This man Luther called dangerous. This man who was currently risking his own life to get her to safety. The ride seemed to last forever, and no time at all. The storm was so fierce she couldn't see anything, could only feel the powerful movements of the horse beneath them, and the solid strength of the man behind her. She had no idea how he was navigating, how he knew where he was going, when she couldn't see more than a foot in any direction. But he never hesitated, never slowed, moving through the blizzard like he could see through the snow to something beyond. When a shape finally emerged from the whiteout, it took her a moment to realize it was a cabin, small and rough-hewn, tucked against the side of a hill with smoke rising from its chimney. Not Stone Valley, somewhere else, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. William's place, she realized with a start. She'd heard about it. The homestead claim he'd filed 2 years ago. The cabin he'd built with his own hands on land nobody else wanted. The place Luther said was barely better than a cave. William brought the horse right up to the cabin door before sliding down, then reached up for her. Grace's frozen brain struggled to make her body obey as she tried to dismount. But her legs wouldn't work right, wouldn't hold her weight. She pitched forward, and William caught her, his arms coming around her to swing her down and against his chest in one motion. For a heartbeat, they were face to face, so close she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could see the concern written in the hard lines of his face, could feel his breath warm against her frozen skin. His arms were steel bands around her, holding her up, holding her safe, and Grace couldn't look away from his eyes. Couldn't think about anything except the way he was looking at her, like she mattered. like finding her alive mattered more than anything in the world. Then, he was moving again, carrying her toward the cabin door like she weighed nothing at all, and Grace let her head rest against his shoulder. Too cold and exhausted and overwhelmed to do anything else. The cabin door swung open under his boot, and blessed warmth rushed out to meet them. William kicked the door shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the wind. And suddenly the world was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth and the sound of their breathing. He carried her straight to the fire and set her down on a thick fur in front of the hearth, his hands lingering on her shoulders for just a moment before he pulled away. Grace's teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak, her whole body shaking with tremors she couldn't control now that she was finally somewhere warm. William didn't waste time. He moved around the cabin with efficient purpose, adding more wood to the fire, filling a pot with snow to melt for water, pulling furs and blankets from somewhere. When he knelt beside her again, his face was all business, but his hands were gentle as he started working at the buttons of her frozen coat. Grace knew she should protest, knew this was improper, knew Luther would have a fit if he knew a man was undressing her. But her fingers were too frozen to manage the buttons herself, and William's face showed nothing but professional concern as he peeled away the wet layers. He'd seen people die of cold before. She could tell by the way he worked, quick and sure and methodical, checking her fingers and toes for frostbite, wrapping her in dry furs, positioning her close enough to the fire to warm up, but not so close she'd burn her frozen skin. He brought her a cup of something hot, holding it to her lips when her hands shook too hard to grasp it. The liquid burned going down, some kind of herbal tea that tasted of mint and something else she couldn't identify. But it was hot, and it was wet, and it made her insides start to thaw. William watched her drink with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Grace found herself staring back, trying to reconcile this careful, competent man with the dangerous savage Luther always described. There was nothing savage about the way he'd wrapped her in furs like she was something precious. Nothing dangerous about the way he'd risked the storm to find her, the way he'd given her his own coat, the way he was now making sure she survived the night. Grace's voice came out as a croak when she finally managed to speak. "Thank you." 2 words that felt woefully inadequate for what he'd done, for the life he'd just saved. William's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, there and gone too fast to name. He just nodded once and turned back to his work, hanging her wet clothes near the fire to dry, checking the door and windows to make sure they were sealed against the storm, moving around the small cabin with the easy competence of a man completely at home in his space. The cabin was small, just one room with the fireplace at one end and a bed at the other, but it was solid and warm and surprisingly well made. The logs were chinked tight against the wind, the floor was smooth planks instead of packed dirt, and there were shelves along one wall holding supplies and books. Books. Grace stared at the worn spines, surprised despite herself. She'd heard William was educated, that he'd been to the mission school before his mother died and his father took him back to the Shoshone. But seeing the evidence was different. Seeing that he had more books than Luther Cross, who was supposed to be the educated gentleman, made her realize how little she actually knew about the man who'd just saved her life. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like all the devils in hell were trying to get in, and Grace sat wrapped in furs by the fire, slowly coming back to life as feeling returned to her extremities and painful pins and needles. William moved around the cabin in near silence, only the creak of floorboards marking his passage. He was tall, she realized, watching him from beneath her lashes. Taller than Luther by several inches, with shoulders that filled his buckskin shirt and moved with a predator's grace. His hair was long, falling past his shoulders, and in the firelight she could see it wasn't pure black, but had red and gold highlights that caught the flames. He'd braided thin sections at his temples, wrapped with leather cord and small feathers that whispered when he moved. His face was all sharp angles and copper skin, high cheekbones, and a strong jaw that spoke of his Shoshone mother, and a straight nose and firm mouth that came from whatever white man had been his father. He was beautiful. The thought came unbidden and made her cheeks flush with more than the heat of the fire. Beautiful in a way that made her chest tight and her breath catch. In a way that was completely improper for her to be noticing when he'd just saved her life, and she was practically engaged to Luther Cross. Except she wasn't engaged to Luther. Not really, he'd asked. 3 times. And she'd put him off 3 times with excuses about needing to think about it, about her father needing her help, about not being ready. The truth was, she didn't love Luther Cross. Didn't even particularly like him most of the time. He was handsome in a conventional way, wealthy from his family's cattle ranch, educated back east, and determined to marry her for reasons she'd never quite understood. Her father approved of the match. Stone Valley society expected it, and Grace had been slowly, reluctantly convincing herself that maybe comfort and security were enough. That maybe love was just a fairy tale, and she should accept the practical reality of becoming Mrs. Luther Cross. Then, William had lifted her onto his horse with hands that made her gasp, and she'd felt more in that moment than she had in 3 years of Luther's courtship. Felt alive and aware and awake in a way that terrified her almost as much as the storm had. William came to check on her again, kneeling beside her with that easy, fluid grace that made everything he did look natural. His dark eyes studied her face, lingering on the color returning to her cheeks. The way her hands had stopped their violent trembling, and now just shook slightly when she moved them. "Can you feel your fingers and toes?" His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it much, and hearing him speak did something strange to her insides. Grace flexed her fingers, testing, and nodded. "Hurts," she admitted, her own voice still scratchy from the cold. "That's good," William said, surprising her. "Means nothing froze. You were lucky." "Lucky?" Grace repeated. And despite everything, a slightly hysterical laugh bubbled up in her chest. Lucky because she'd nearly frozen to death in a blizzard and had to be rescued by a man she barely knew, and was now stranded in his cabin, God knew how far from town, with her reputation in tatters, if anyone ever found out. Lucky because instead of being grateful to Luther for his proposal, she was sitting here, staring at William's mouth, and wondering what it would feel like to be kissed by someone who looked at her like that. With concern and care, but also something else. Something heated that made her skin prickle despite the furs wrapped around her. William's mouth twitched, just slightly, like he was fighting a smile. "Lucky because you're alive," he clarified, and the simple way he said it, like her life mattered, like her being alive was important, made Grace's throat go tight with unexpected emotion. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and William held her gaze for another long moment before standing and moving back to his work. He made them a simple meal, venison stew from a pot that had been simmering on the edge of the fire, with cornbread he must have made earlier in the day. Grace ate ravenously, not realizing how hungry she was until the food was in front of her, and William watched her with something that might have been satisfaction as she cleaned her plate. Outside, The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had gotten worse. The wind shrieking around the cabin like a living thing. The cold so fierce Grace could feel it, trying to seep through the walls despite the roaring fire. She shivered, and William immediately moved to add more wood, building the fire up until heat rolled off it in waves. "You'll stay here tonight," William said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. The storm won't break before morning. Maybe not even then. Grace knew she should protest, should insist on somehow getting back to town despite the weather, should worry about what people would say about her spending the night unchaperoned with a man. But she was warm for the first time in hours, and safe, and the thought of going back out into that storm made her stomach clench with primal fear. Besides, what choice did she have? It was stay here or die. Even Luther couldn't argue with those odds. "I'm grateful," she said instead, meeting William's eyes. "You saved my life. I don't know how to repay that." William's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "That's what we do out here. We help each other survive." Except Luther had ridden past her twice last winter, when she'd been walking back from house calls. And he'd never once offered her a ride, unless there was someone around to see his gallantry. William had ridden into a killing storm to find her, with no audience to impress, and no expectation of thanks. The night deepened, the cabin growing cozy with the warmth of the fire, and the howling storm locked safely outside. William gave her his bed, a narrow frame built into the wall with a real mattress and heavy furs for blankets, refusing her protests with quiet insistence. He would sleep by the fire, he said, or he could keep it fed through the night. Grace was too exhausted to argue much, and the bed looked impossibly inviting after the ordeal she'd been through. She settled into it, still wrapped in her borrowed furs, her dress mostly dry now but rumpled beyond repair, her hair a tangled mess she'd given up trying to pin properly. From the bed, she could see William sitting by the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light as he stared into the flames. He'd pulled his hair back, tying it with a leather cord, and the movement had made his shirt pull tight across his shoulders in a way that made her mouth go dry. Grace closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, to stop noticing things about William that she had no business noticing. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, her dreams were full of strong hands on her waist and dark eyes that saw too much, and the feeling of being held against a chest that felt like home. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's small window, and the sound of the fire crackling peacefully. The storm had died sometime in the night, leaving the world outside hushed and heavy with new snow. Grace sat up, disoriented for a moment, and then the previous day came flooding back. The storm, the cold, William. She looked around the cabin and found him already awake, standing at the window and looking out at the snow-covered landscape. He'd changed clothes, she realized, now wearing different buckskins and a heavy wool shirt, his hair still tied back, but slightly damp, like he'd washed in the melted snow. He must have heard her stirring, because he turned, and Grace was struck again by how handsome he was in the morning light, all sharp angles and quiet strength. "Morning," William said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Storm passed. I'll take you home after breakfast." Home. Back to Stone Valley. Back to her father's house. Back to Luther Cross and his persistent proposals and society's expectations. Grace should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. William made them coffee. Real coffee. Rich and strong, and better than anything Grace had tasted in months. And she wrapped her hands around the tin cup and breathed in the steam gratefully. He served her more cornbread, with honey and strips of venison jerky. And they ate in comfortable silence, while the cabin warmed with the morning fire. Grace found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing the way his hands moved with such competence and care. The way he sat with a stillness that spoke of patience, learned from tracking game through the wilderness. The way his dark eyes saw everything, even when he seemed to be looking, at nothing in particular. She wanted to ask him questions, wanted to know where he'd learned to track, where he'd gotten his books, what had brought him to Wyoming territory to file a homestead claim on land most white men wouldn't touch. Wanted to know if he had family, if he was lonely out here by himself, if he ever thought about the girl whose life he'd saved in the storm. But before she could work up the courage to speak, William stood and moved to gather her dried clothes. "I'll saddle the horse," he said, all business again. "We should leave soon. The snow's deep, but the horse can manage it." Grace nodded, taking her clothes with hands that trembled slightly, for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. She dressed quickly while William was outside, lacing up her dress and boots with fingers that fumbled over the familiar task. Her hair was hopeless, tangled beyond her ability to fix without a proper brush and mirror. So she just twisted it up as best she could and pinned it with the few pins she could find in her bag. She looked a mess, she knew, rumpled and disheveled, and thoroughly improper. Luther would be scandalized. The thought made her smile, despite herself. When she emerged from the cabin, William had his big bay horse ready, saddled and standing patient in the deep snow. The world was transformed. Every tree and rock and hollow buried under 2 feet of fresh powder that sparkled in the weak winter sun. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. And Grace understood for the first time why William had chosen this place, why he'd built his cabin here in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but wilderness for company. The ride back to Stone Valley was slower than the frantic race through the storm, but no less intimate. William sat behind her again, one arm around her waist to keep her steady, and Grace was achingly aware of every point where their bodies touched. The horse picked its way carefully through the deep snow, and Grace watched the landscape pass by, memorizing the route without quite meaning to. She could find her way back here if she needed to. The thought came unbidden and made her cheeks flush. Why would she need to find her way back? She had no reason to visit William's homestead again. No reason to see him after today. The thought made her chest ache in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. They crested a rise, and Stone Valley came into view below, smoke rising from chimneys, the main street already being cleared of snow by industrious shopkeepers. Civilization, safety, everything she should want. Grace felt William tense behind her, his arm tightening slightly around her waist, and she realized he was as reluctant for this ride to end as she was. They came into town from the north, and Grace saw the moment people spotted them. Saw Mrs. Henderson's mouth fall open as she swept her porch. Saw Mr. Thompson pause in shoveling his walk to stare. Saw the cluster of women outside the general store turn as one to watch William guide his horse down the main street, with the doctor's daughter held in his arms. Grace felt William's arm loosen around her waist as they approached her father's house, felt him start to pull away even before they'd fully stopped. She wanted to tell him not to, wanted to keep that solid warmth at her back just a little longer, but propriety had already been damaged enough. Her father came bursting out of the house before William could dismount. His face, a mask of relief and fury and fear all mixed together. "Grace, thank God. Where have you been?" "I've been worried sick. I was about to organize a search party. Luther's been here 3 times already demanding to know where you were." William slid down from his horse and reached up to help Grace dismount. His hands on her waist again, careful and steady, and somehow different in front of an audience. He set her on her feet and stepped back immediately, putting proper distance between them. Dr. Hammond's eyes went from his daughter's rumpled state to William's calm face, and his expression shifted to something Grace couldn't quite read. "What happened?" he demanded, and Grace opened her mouth to explain, but William spoke first. His voice flat and neutral. "Found her on the trail to the Peterson place during the storm. She would have frozen without shelter. Brought her to my cabin until it was safe to travel." He said it simply, stating facts with no embellishment, and Grace's father studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then I owe you my daughter's life," Dr. Hammond said, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice even if his eyes were troubled by the implications. William just shook his head once, already turning back to his horse. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, and swung back into his saddle with that fluid grace Grace was coming to recognize. He looked at her once more, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And then he was riding away, back toward the edge of town and the wilderness beyond. And Grace felt something vital inside her go with him. Her father ushered her into the house, peppering her with questions about frostbite and her health, examining her with professional thoroughness, even as he scolded her for going out in the storm alone. Grace answered mechanically, her mind still on the cabin, on the way William had wrapped her in furs like she was precious, on the feeling of his arms around her on the ride home. She was barely aware of her father finishing his examination and declaring her remarkably well considering the ordeal. Barely heard him telling her to rest, while he went to let Luther know she was safe. Luther. Grace's stomach sank. She'd forgotten about Luther in the warmth of William's cabin, in the safety of his arms. Now he would come, full of concern and possessiveness, and she'd have to explain where she'd been and who she'd been with, and he would make it all sound sordid when it had been anything but. She changed into clean clothes, brushed out her tangled hair, and tried to make herself presentable before the inevitable confrontation. She was sitting in the parlor when she heard the front door bang open, and Luther's voice calling her name with that particular tone that meant he was upset and trying not to show it. Luther Cross was everything Stone Valley society thought a man should be. Tall and handsome with dark blonde hair and blue eyes, educated at a fancy Eastern school, heir to the largest cattle ranch in the territory. He wore fine clothes even for every day, tailored suits that never seemed to get dirty no matter what he was doing. And he moved through town with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Grace had known him since childhood, had danced with him at socials, had listened to his stories about Boston and New York with polite interest. And she'd felt nothing. No spark, no attraction, no desire for anything more than pleasant friendship. When he'd started courting her 2 years ago, she'd been surprised. When he'd proposed the first time 6 months later, she'd been stunned. She still didn't understand what he wanted with her. There were prettier girls, wealthier girls, girls who actually seemed to like him. But Luther had fixed his attention on her with a determination that felt more like stubbornness than love. And now here he was, striding into her parlor with thunder in his eyes. "Grace," Luther said. And there was relief in his voice, but also something else. Something sharp and possessive that made her tense. "Thank God you're safe. When your father said you'd been caught in the storm, I nearly lost my mind with worry." He came to her, taking her hands in his before she could pull away, his fingers cold despite his gloves. He studied her face like he was looking for damage, and Grace resisted the urge to pull back from his scrutiny. "I'm fine," she said, trying for a reassuring smile. "Just cold. But William found me before it got too bad." At the mention of William's name, Luther's expression darkened. "Yes, your father told me. You spent the night at that half-breed tracker's cabin. Alone. Unchaperoned. Grace, do you have any idea what people are saying?" Grace felt anger flare hot in her chest, burning away the lingering warmth from the morning. "Don't call him that," she said sharply, pulling her hands from Luther's grasp. "His name is William, and he saved my life when I would have frozen to death. What was I supposed to do? Refuse shelter? And die in the snow to protect my reputation?" Luther's jaw tightened, that vein in his temple starting to throb the way it did when he was working himself up to real anger. "Of course not. But Grace, you have to understand how this looks. People are already talking. Mrs. Henderson saw you riding into town in his arms, like some kind of—" He paused, seeming to search for a word that wouldn't be too offensive. "Like you belonged to him." The way Luther said it, dripping with disdain and disapproval, made something inside Grace snap. "Maybe I did belong there," she heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Maybe I was safer in William's cabin than I would have been anywhere else in this territory. At least he treated me with respect and kindness, instead of acting like I'm property to be claimed." Luther recoiled like she'd slapped him, his face going red and then pale. "Is that what you think of me? That I see you as property? Grace, I love you. I've been courting you for 2 years, waiting patiently for you to accept my proposal. Everything I do is out of concern for your welfare and your reputation. If you marry me, this scandal will blow over. People will forgive an indiscretion if it happened before we were engaged. We can even move the wedding up. Make it next month, instead of waiting until spring." Grace stared at him, really looked at him for the first time in months, and saw not the man who supposedly loved her, but the man who wanted to possess her, to own her, to mold her into the proper wife he thought he deserved. "I never said I'd marry you in the spring," Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I never said I'd marry you at all, Luther. I've put you off 3 times, because the answer has always been no. I just didn't have the courage to say it plainly until now." Luther's face went through several shades of red and white, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This is about him, isn't it? That savage who lives like an animal in the woods. One night in his cabin, and suddenly, you think you're too good for me?" Grace stood, drawing herself up to her full height, and meeting Luther's eyes with a calm she didn't quite feel. "This has nothing to do with William, and everything to do with you and me. I don't love you, Luther. I don't even like you most of the time. You're controlling and condescending, and you treat everyone you think is beneath you with contempt. I won't marry a man who calls another human being a savage just because his mother was Shoshone. I won't marry a man who sees kindness as weakness and compassion as something to mock. I won't marry you, Luther Cross, not next month, and not ever." The silence that followed was deafening. Luther stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and wounded pride, and for a moment, Grace thought he might actually hit her. But then, his expression shifted to something cold and calculating, something that made her skin crawl. "You'll regret this," he said softly, each word precise and cutting. "You and your half-breed tracker both. Stone Valley doesn't take kindly to women who throw away respectable offers for savages. You'll be ruined, Grace. No decent man will have you after this. And as for William, well, accidents happen out in the wilderness, especially to men who don't know their place." The threat was clear, barely veiled, and Grace felt ice slide down her spine. Luther smiled, a thin, cruel expression that bore no resemblance to warmth, and walked out without another word, leaving Grace standing in her parlor with her hands shaking and her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and fury. Her father found her there 10 minutes later, still standing in the same spot, staring at nothing. He took one look at her face and sighed heavily. "You refused him," he said, not a question. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Her father was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler than she expected. "I won't say I'm not disappointed. Luther would have been a good match from a practical standpoint. But Grace, I didn't raise you to marry a man you don't love just for security. If your heart isn't in it, then you were right to refuse." Grace looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw the man who'd taught her medicine, who'd let her help with his patients when other fathers would have locked their daughters away from such unseemly work, who'd raised her alone after her mother died, and never once told her she should be less than shush. He was. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered, and felt tears prick her eyes. Her father pulled her into a hug, patting her back awkwardly the way he always did. "But Grace," he said quietly, "be careful. Luther Cross is not a man who handles rejection well. And William," he paused, "William is a good man, but the world won't see it that way. Whatever you're feeling, whatever happened in that cabin, just be careful." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of tension and whispered gossip. Grace went about her work, helping her father with his patients, making house calls with her medical bag, delivering Mrs. Peterson's baby successfully despite the complications from the early labor. But everywhere she went, she felt the weight of Stone Valley's judgment. Women who'd been friendly before now crossed the street to avoid her. Men looked at her with speculation that made her skin crawl. And Luther made sure everyone knew that Grace Hammond had thrown away his respectable proposal to chase after a half-breed tracker, that she'd spent the night alone with William in his cabin, doing God knew what, that she'd chosen shame over honor and would pay the price for it. Grace held her head high and ignored the gossip as best she could, but it wore on her. The constant whispers and sideways glances, the way people treated her like she'd committed some unforgivable sin by accepting shelter from a storm. She didn't see William. He didn't come to town, and she had no reason to ride out to his homestead. No excuse that wouldn't make the gossip worse. But she thought about him constantly. Thought about the way he'd wrapped her in furs, the way his hands had been so careful on her waist, the way his dark eyes had seen her, really seen her, not as the doctor's daughter or Luther's intended, but as Grace, just Grace. A woman worth saving. She wondered if he'd heard the gossip, if he knew what Luther was saying about both of them, if he regretted helping her that night in the storm. The thought that her salvation might have brought him trouble made her chest ache with guilt and something deeper, something she was afraid to examine too closely. 3 weeks after the storm, Grace was walking home from the Miller farm, where she'd treated old Mr. Miller's pneumonia when she saw smoke rising from the direction of William's homestead. Too much smoke. Not the gentle curl of a cooking fire, but thick black columns that spoke of something burning out of control. Her heart stopped, then started again at double speed. Grace dropped her medical bag and ran, hiking up her skirts and running through the snow like her life depended on it, like William's life depended on it. She could hear shouts behind her, people from town seeing the smoke and following, but she didn't wait for them. She just ran, her breath burning in her lungs, her boots slipping in the snow, terror giving her strength she didn't know she had. It took 20 minutes to reach the homestead. 20 minutes that felt like hours. And when she finally burst through the tree line, the sight that met her eyes made her scream. William's cabin was an inferno. Flames shooting through the roof, smoke billowing black and thick into the gray winter sky. And there, on the ground in front of the burning building, was William, trying to crawl toward the cabin door, blood streaming down his face from a gash on his temple. Grace was there in seconds, grabbing him, pulling him back from the heat, screaming his name over the roar of the flames. William fought her weakly, trying to get back to the cabin, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Books," he gasped. "My mother's things. Have to." But Grace held him with strength born of desperation, dragging him further from the fire even as the cabin's roof collapsed with a shower of sparks and a roar like a dying beast. "No," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You can't. It's gone. William, please. You'll die, please." William stopped fighting, his body going limp in her arms, and Grace pulled him against her chest, holding him while his life's work burned to ash and Stone Valley's people came running up to watch. Someone had hit him, she realized, seeing the blood on his face, the way he was holding his ribs like they might be broken. Someone had knocked him unconscious and set his cabin on fire, had tried to burn him alive inside it. And Grace knew with horrible certainty exactly who had done it. Luther Cross had made good on his threat. "Accidents happen in the wilderness," he'd said, "especially to men who don't know their place." The town doctor, Grace's father, arrived minutes later, puffing from the run, his medical bag in hand. Grace was kneeling in the snow with William's head in her lap, her hands pressing her folded shawl against the gash on his temple to stop the bleeding. And she looked up at her father with eyes that blazed with fury and fear. "Someone did this," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone attacked him and tried to burn him alive." Her father knelt beside them, already examining William with professional efficiency, checking his pupils, his pulse, the way he was breathing. "Possible concussion," he muttered. "Definitely bruised or broken ribs. Needs proper care. We'll take him to our house." Some of the men who'd come running started to protest, saying William should go to the boarding house if anywhere, saying the doctor's house wasn't appropriate. But Grace's father silenced them with a look that could have frozen hell. "This man was nearly murdered on my watch in my territory," Dr. Hammond said coldly. "He'll recover in my house where I can monitor his condition properly, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with the territorial marshal." They carried William back to town on a makeshift stretcher, Grace walking beside him the whole way, her hand holding his even though it made the gossip worse. Even though she could hear the whispers and see the scandalized looks, she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them judge. William had almost died because of her, because Luther was a petty, vengeful man who couldn't stand rejection, and she'd be damned if she'd leave him alone now. They settled William in the guest room, the small room at the back of the house that had a good view of the snowy mountains. and caught the morning sun. Grace's father cleaned and stitched the gash on William's temple, wrapped his ribs tight, and left him to rest with strict orders that Grace should check on him every hour through the night for signs of worsening head injury. Grace nodded, already pulling a chair up beside the bed, settling in to watch over the man who'd saved her life and nearly lost his own because of it. William woke as darkness fell, his dark eyes opening slowly, confusion giving way to awareness, and then to something like despair when he remembered. "The cabin," he said hoarsely, and Grace squeezed his hand gently. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "It's gone. Everything's gone." William closed his eyes, and Grace saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "My mother's medicine bag," he said quietly. "The blanket she made. Her Bible with our family names. The books my teacher gave me. 20 years of my life. Just gone." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, felt the weight of guilt crushing her chest. "It was Luther," she said, the words bitter as poison. "He did this because I refused him, because I wouldn't let him control me. This is my fault." William's eyes opened, sharp despite the pain he must be in, and he looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. "No," he said firmly. "This is Luther Cross's fault. His choice. His evil. Not yours. Never yours." But Grace couldn't accept that absolution. Couldn't forgive herself for bringing this destruction into William's life. The territorial marshal came the next day, a grizzled man named Carson, who'd seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by much. He questioned William about the attack, took notes about the mysterious blow to the head, the cabin fire, the timing that coincided so neatly with Luther Cross's public threats against William. But when Carson went to question Luther, the cattle baron had a dozen witnesses who swore he'd been at his ranch all day, playing cards with his foreman and 3 ranch hands who all backed his story without blinking. "No proof," Carson told Grace and her father grimly. Cross covered his tracks too well, probably paid someone to do it for him, so his hands would be clean. "Without evidence or witnesses, there's nothing I can do legally." Grace wanted to scream with frustration, wanted to storm over to Luther's ranch and demand justice. But her father held her back with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The law can't help us," Dr. Hammond said quietly, "but that doesn't mean Cross gets away with it. Justice comes in many forms, and Stone Valley has a long memory." William recovered slowly. The concussion left him with headaches and dizziness for the first week, and his ribs took longer, every breath painful, for nearly a month. Grace tended him with fierce dedication, checking on him through the nights, bringing him meals, reading to him when the headaches made it hard for him to focus on anything. They talked during those long hours of recovery, really talked in a way Grace had never talked with anyone before. William told her about his mother, a Shoshone woman who'd fallen in love with a white trapper and been cast out by her people for it. Told her about growing up caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, learning to track and hunt from his father in medicine and languages from the mission school. Told her about his mother dying of fever when he was 15, his father drinking himself to death 2 years later, about being alone in the world with nothing but the skills they taught him, and a determination to make something of himself despite what society thought of half-breeds. Grace told him about her own mother, dead of childbed fever when Grace was 8, about growing up helping her father because there was no one else, about discovering she had a gift for medicine and healing. Told him about the loneliness of being different in a small town, about wanting more than marriage and children, even though that was all women were supposed to want. about feeling guilty for not loving Luther when everyone said she should. And William listened. Really listened. Not trying to fix her or tell her what to feel. Just accepting her exactly as she was. It was intoxicating, that acceptance. Dangerous. Grace found herself watching the way his hair fell across his face when he leaned forward. The way his hands moved when he gestured. The sound of his rare laugh when she said something that amused him. Found herself staying longer each day, finding excuses to be near him, touching his hand when she checked his pulse, and letting her fingers linger longer than medically necessary. A month after the fire, William was well enough to move around, though his ribs still ached, and the headaches still came when he was tired. He helped around the house despite Dr. Hammond's protests, chopping wood and carrying water, and making repairs to things that had needed fixing for months. Grace would watch him from the kitchen window, her hands still in the bread dough she was kneading, and feel her heart do strange things in her chest. He'd tied his hair back with leather cord, and his shirt pulled tight across his shoulders when he swung the axe. And she couldn't look away, even though she knew she should. Knew this fascination was dangerous. Knew she was already ruined in Stone Valley's eyes, and getting more attached to William would only make it worse. But she couldn't seem to stop, couldn't seem to do anything but fall, slowly and inevitably, completely and hopelessly, in love with a man the world said she shouldn't want. It was William who finally brought it up, one evening when they were alone in the parlor, Grace mending one of her father's shirts, and William reading one of the books her father had lent him. "Grace," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up from her sewing. "I need to leave. Soon. Go north to Montana, or maybe Oregon. File a new claim somewhere Luther Cross's reach doesn't extend. Your father's been generous letting me stay here, but I'm healed now. And my being here is making things worse for you and your reputation." Grace felt her chest constrict, felt panic rise in her throat at the thought of William leaving, of never seeing him again. "You can't leave," she said, the words coming out more desperate than she meant them to. "Luther will just follow you. Will make trouble wherever you go. And besides, she faltered, not sure how to say what she felt, how to admit the truth that had been growing in her heart for weeks. "I don't want you to go." William set down his book, his dark eyes finding hers across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Grace," he said carefully, like he was choosing each word with precision. "You know what people are saying about us. About you, that you're a ruined woman, that you've been, that we've," he broke off, seeming to struggle with the words. "Your reputation is already damaged. If I stay, if we continue like this, it will only get worse. Unless," he paused, his jaw tightening like the next words cost him something. "Unless you marry Luther Cross after all. Make amends with him. Restore your standing in society. I'll leave quietly and take the blame for everything. Say I took advantage. And eventually, people will forgive you, and you can have the life you deserve." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "The life I deserve," she repeated slowly, and then louder, her voice shaking with emotion. "The life I deserve? William, the life I deserve is not being Luther Cross's property. Not living in a gilded cage being paraded around like a prize he won. The life I deserve is," she took a breath, steadying herself, "is choosing my own path. Being with someone who respects me, who sees me as an equal, who doesn't try to control or diminish me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings and possibilities neither dared voice. William stood slowly, crossing the room to where Grace sat with her forgotten mending in her lap. He knelt in front of her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers, and Grace's breath stopped entirely at the look on his face. Barely controlled longing mixed with determination and fear. "Grace," he said, his voice rough and low, "if you're saying what I think you're saying, I need you to be sure. I have nothing to offer you. No home, no wealth, no standing in society. I'm a half-breed tracker who lives on the edge of civilization and will never be accepted by your world. If you choose me, you're choosing hardship and struggle, and a life that will never be easy. You'll be cut off from respectable society, from the comfort and security you could have had. And I won't let you make that choice unless you're absolutely certain, unless you know exactly what you're giving up and what you're getting in return." Grace reached out slowly, her hand trembling only slightly as she touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the high arch of his cheekbone, the leather cord that held his hair back. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What I'm getting in return is you, William. Your kindness and strength and honor. Your respect and your care. A partnership instead of ownership. A home built on love instead of obligation. That's worth more than all the security and standing in the world. And what I'm giving up," she smiled despite the tears gathering in her eyes, "what I'm giving up is a life that would have slowly killed my soul. So yes, I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. If you'll have me." William's control broke like a dam giving way, and suddenly his hands were on her face, cupping her cheeks with a gentleness that belied their strength, and he was pulling her toward him as he rose up on his knees. And then his mouth was on hers, and Grace forgot how to breathe. The kiss was everything Grace had imagined, and nothing she could have prepared for. William kissed like he did everything else, with complete focus and careful intensity, like she was precious and essential and worth taking time over. His lips were warm and firm, moving against hers with a certainty that made her melt. And when his tongue traced the seam of her mouth, requesting entrance, Grace opened for him with a gasp. She'd been kissed before, chaste pecks from Luther that felt more like duty than desire. But this was different. This was kissing like it meant something, like it was the beginning of something bigger than both of them. William's hands slid from her face into her hair, scattering pins until the honey-colored mass tumbled down around her shoulders. And he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat pooling in her belly. Grace's hands found his shoulders, gripping tight, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, and she kissed him back with all the longing and want and love she'd been holding in for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, William rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his hands still tangled in her hair. "Marry me," he said, the words somewhere between a question and a prayer. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of the gift you're giving me. Let me build you a home and fill it with love and give you everything I have, which isn't much, but it's yours if you want it." Grace laughed, the sound watery with tears and joy and overwhelming emotion. "Yes," she said, pulling back just enough to see his face, to see the hope and love written in his dark eyes. "Yes, William, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life." And when he kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, she knew she'd made the right choice. Knew that this man, this good and honorable man, was worth every whisper and every judgment Stone Valley could throw at her. They were married a week later, in a quiet ceremony at the small church on the edge of town, with only Grace's father and the minister present. Luther Cross had threatened to make trouble if they used the main church, and rather than cause a scene, they'd chosen peace over spectacle. Grace wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, cream-colored silk with pearl buttons and lace at the throat and wrists. William wore new clothes her father had helped him buy, dark trousers and a white shirt and a black vest that made him look devastatingly handsome. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when William slid a simple gold band onto her finger and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her father's eyes, Grace felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home, like finding the place she was always meant to be. They spent their wedding night in the guest room of her father's house, wrapped in each other's arms. And Grace learned that intimacy with someone you loved was nothing like she'd feared and everything she'd hoped for. William was gentle and patient and careful, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished and wanted. And when he held her afterward, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair, Grace thought she might die from the sheer, overwhelming happiness of it all. But happiness in Stone Valley was a fragile thing, easily shattered. They'd been married 3 days when Grace and William were in the general store buying supplies, and Luther Cross walked in with 2 of his ranch hands. The store went silent, every eye turning to watch the confrontation everyone knew was coming. Luther's gaze swept over them with cold disdain, lingering on the way William stood slightly in front of Grace, protective without being obvious, on the gold band on Grace's finger that proclaimed her a married woman. "So it's true," Luther said, his voice carrying through the quiet store. "The doctor's daughter married the half-breed. How tragic. How utterly predictable." Grace felt William tense beside her, felt his hand find hers and squeeze gently, a silent request for patience. "We don't want trouble, Luther," Grace said evenly, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "We're just buying supplies and then we'll be on our way." Luther laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Oh, I'm not going to make trouble, Grace. You've already done that yourself. But I thought you should know that I filed a claim on the land adjacent to where your dear husband's cabin used to stand. I'll be building a line shack there for my northern range. So you'll have me as a neighbor. Isn't that wonderful?" The threat was clear. Luther would be watching them, making trouble, making sure their life was as difficult as possible. But Grace just lifted her chin and met his eyes without flinching. "How nice for us," she said sweetly. "I'm sure you'll be much too busy with your cattle to bother with us." William's hand squeezed hers again, this time in what felt like pride, and he stepped forward just slightly, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made Luther's ranch hands shift nervously. "We'll be building our new cabin on different land anyway," William said quietly. "The homestead office has already approved my new claim. 20 miles north, deep in the mountains. Beautiful country up there. Private. Far from neighbors who might cause problems." He said it casually, but the message was clear. They'd be beyond Luther's easy reach, too far for casual harassment, protected by distance and wilderness. Luther's face went red, then pale, his jaw clenching with barely controlled fury. "You'll regret this," he said, the words meant for both of them. "Both of you. The wilderness is dangerous. Accidents happen. People disappear. William just smiled, a cold expression that had nothing to do with warmth. "People do disappear," he agreed softly. "But I know every inch of that wilderness. I can track anything that moves through it. And I protect what's mine." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and warning. And Luther seemed to realize he'd pushed as far as he could without escalating to actual violence in a public place. He left with his men, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, and the store let out a collective breath. Mr. Thompson, the store owner, came over with their supplies and refused to let them pay. "On the house," he said gruffly, not quite meeting their eyes. For what it's worth, that crossboy had it coming. Been needing someone to stand up to him for years. Other people murmured agreement, and Grace realized with surprise that maybe Stone Valley wasn't quite as united in its judgment as she thought. Maybe there were people who saw Luther for what he was, who respected William for his quiet strength, who understood that love was worth fighting for. They left the store with their supplies and their dignity intact, and Grace felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe they could build a life here. That maybe they could find happiness despite Luther's vendetta. That maybe love really was enough to overcome the obstacles in their path. William built them a temporary shelter on her father's property while they prepared for the move north. Just a small lean-to, really, but private enough that they could be alone as husband and wife, could learn each other's rhythms and habits and quirks. Grace discovered that William sang while he worked, old Shoshone songs his mother had taught him mixed with hymns from the mission school. Discovered that he was ticklish, just under his ribs on the left side. That he made terrible coffee but excellent stew. That he always woke before dawn and liked to watch the sun rise in silence before the day began. William discovered that Grace talked in her sleep, mumbling about medical procedures and patient care. Discovered that she couldn't cook to save her life, but could set a broken bone in under 5 minutes. That she hoarded books like treasure and read late into the night by lamplight. That she was terrified of spiders but completely fearless in the face of human danger. They learned to be married, to navigate the strange intimacy of sharing space and life and future. And with each passing day, Grace fell more deeply in love with the man she'd chosen. Winter started to release its grip as February gave way to March. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the brown earth underneath, and the first green shoots of spring pushed through in sheltered valleys. William and Grace prepared for their move north, packing supplies and planning their new homestead with the careful attention of people building a future. Grace's father watched them with a mixture of pride and sorrow, happy for his daughter but sad to see her go so far away. They promised to visit, to come back to Stone Valley at least twice a year. And Dr. Hammond made them promise to be careful, to watch out for Luther's revenge that would surely come. The threat came sooner than expected. They were 2 weeks from their planned departure when Grace was making a late-night house call to the Johnsons' farm, their youngest daughter burning up with fever. William had offered to come with her, but the Johnsons lived only a mile from town, and Grace thought she'd be fine alone. She was wrong. She was riding back just after midnight, her horse picking its way carefully along the muddy road, when 3 men stepped out of the shadows. They wore masks, but Grace knew Luther's ranch hands by their builds, by the way they moved. The biggest one grabbed her horse's bridle while the other 2 circled, and Grace's heart hammered with terror and fury. "Get away from me," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm just going home. I haven't done anything to you." The big one laughed, a cruel sound. "You married that half-breed," one of them said, his voice muffled behind his mask. "Mr. Cross says that's crime enough. Says we should teach you what happens to white women who forget their place." Grace felt ice slide down her spine, understanding exactly what they meant to do. She reached for the small pistol William had insisted she carry, the Derringer tucked in her coat pocket. But the second man was faster. He grabbed her arm, yanking her off her horse with enough force that she hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. The pistol fell from her grip, lost in the mud. Grace screamed, loud and long, hoping someone would hear, but they were too far from any houses, too isolated for help to come. The men laughed at her terror, closing in, and Grace scrambled backward through the mud, her mind racing for any escape, any weapon, anything. Then she heard it, a sound that made the three men freeze, the whistle of something cutting through air. And suddenly one of the ranch hands was on the ground, screaming, an arrow through his shoulder. The other two spun, trying to find the threat, and William stepped out of the shadows like he'd materialized from the darkness itself. He had his bow in hand, another arrow already knocked and drawn, his face a mask of cold fury that made him look every inch the warrior his mother's people would have been proud of. He said something in Shoshone, the words harsh and guttural, and Grace didn't need to speak the language to understand the meaning. Touch her again, and you die. The two standing men hesitated, caught between their orders and the very real threat in front of them. And William's voice cut through the night, ice cold and deadly calm. "Tell Luther Cross that if he comes after my wife again, I won't stop with an arrow through the shoulder. Tell him I'll track him through hell itself and make him pay for every threat, every insult, every moment of fear he's caused her. Tell him the next time he sends men after Grace, he'd better send better ones. Because these three aren't walking away if they don't leave right now." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real, and something in William's eyes must have convinced them he meant every word. The two uninjured men grabbed their wounded companion and ran, leaving Grace shaking in the mud and William standing over her like an avenging angel. He was there in seconds, his bow set aside, his hands on her face, checking for injuries with the same careful efficiency her father used. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Grace, did they are you?" He couldn't seem to finish the question, and Grace shook her head frantically. "No," she gasped. "You got here in time. They didn't. I'm just scared, William, I'm so scared." He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could barely breathe, and Grace felt him shaking too, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear and rage. "I followed you," he said against her hair, his voice breaking slightly. "I had a bad feeling, couldn't shake it, so I followed at a distance. When I heard you scream," he broke off, his arms tightening even more. "Grace, if I'd been even a minute later, if they'd..." He couldn't finish, just held her while they both shook with the horror of what had almost happened. Grace buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent, feeling his heart hammer against her cheek, and knew with absolute certainty that Luther Cross would never stop, would keep coming after them, keep sending men, keep making their lives hell, until someone ended up dead. They rode home together, Grace on William's horse with his arms around her, both of them silent with the weight of what had happened and what it meant for their future. Dr. Hammond took one look at his daughter's muddy, shaken state and William's grim expression and knew without being told. He tended the scrapes on Grace's hands and knees, while William paced the kitchen like a caged wolf, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "We leave tomorrow," William said finally, his voice flat and hard. "Not in 2 weeks. Tomorrow, we pack what we can carry, and we go north, and we don't come back until Luther Cross is dead, or in prison, or no longer a threat." Dr. Hammond started to protest, to argue about preparation and planning. But one look at Grace's face, at the terror still lingering in her eyes, and he nodded slowly. "I'll help you pack," he said quietly. "And I'll send word to Marshal Carson about what happened tonight. Maybe this time Luther went too far. Maybe this time there will be consequences." But they all knew there wouldn't be. Luther's men wore masks. Grace couldn't identify them for certain in the dark. William's arrow had struck the man's left shoulder, but dozens of ranch hands got injured all the time. There was no proof, no witnesses, nothing that would hold up in territorial court against a wealthy cattleman's word. So they packed through the night, loading 2 horses with supplies and equipment, clothes and food and medicine, books and tools and everything they'd need to build a life in the wilderness. Grace kissed her father goodbye as dawn broke over Stone Valley, both of them crying, both knowing it might be a long time before they saw each other again. "Be happy," Dr. Hammond told his daughter, his voice thick with emotion. "Be safe." "And Grace," he pulled her close one last time, "you chose well. William's a good man, better than this town deserves." Grace nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. And then William was helping her onto her horse, and they were riding out of Stone Valley as the town woke up around them. They rode north for 3 days, following game trails that wound through the mountains, climbing higher and deeper into wilderness that grew more beautiful and more isolated with every mile. William seemed to relax as they left civilization behind, his shoulders losing their tense set, his eyes brightening as he showed her the land he'd chosen for their homestead. They camped beside streams still half frozen with winter ice, cooked over open fires, slept wrapped in furs with the stars bright overhead, and Grace discovered that she loved it. Loved the freedom and the wildness. Loved being away from Stone Valley's judgment and expectations. Loved having nothing but William, and the wilderness, and the future they would build together. On the 4th day, they reached the valley William had chosen. It was breathtaking, a wide meadow surrounded by pine-covered mountains, with a stream running through it that would provide water year-round. The meadow was just starting to show signs of spring, green shoots pushing through the last of the snow. And Grace could already imagine it in summer, full of wildflowers and life. "This is it," William said, his voice quiet with something that might have been hope or pride or both. "This is where we'll build our home." Grace looked at the valley, at the mountains rising around it like protective walls, at the stream singing over stones, and the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. "It's perfect," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They set to work immediately, using the temporary shelter William had built on his first scouting trip, while they planned the cabin. Grace helped fell trees, strip bark, notch logs. Her hands blistered, and her back ached, and she'd never been happier in her life. William taught her to fish in the stream, to identify edible plants as they emerged with spring's warmth, to read the signs that told stories about what animals had passed through and when. She taught him more about medicine, about treating injuries and illnesses with the supplies they'd brought and the plants that grew wild. They worked from dawn until dark, building their home log by log, building their life moment by moment. The cabin took shape slowly through April and into May, becoming more than just shelter, becoming home. William built it strong and tight, with real windows he'd packed in carefully, and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the next winter. Grace made curtains from fabric she'd brought from Stone Valley, planted a garden beside the cabin with seeds her father had given her as a parting gift, hung herbs to dry from the rafters. They made love in their half-finished cabin with the stars visible through the gaps in the roof, and Grace thought she'd never felt more alive, more herself, more exactly where she was supposed to be. Summer came to the valley in a rush of warmth and growth. The meadow exploded with wildflowers, purple lupine and yellow glacier lilies, and red Indian paintbrush, painting the grass in riot of color. Grace's garden flourished in the rich soil, producing more vegetables than 2 people could eat. William hunted and fished, keeping them supplied with meat, and taught Grace to tan hides and smoke fish, and preserve food for the winter to come. They had visitors occasionally, trappers passing through, or Shoshone hunters from William's mother's band, who came to see the half-blood who'd married a white woman and chosen to live the old ways. The Shoshone treated Grace with cautious respect, testing her at first, then warming when they saw she wasn't like other white women they'd encountered. She learned a few words of their language, accepted their gifts of beautifully worked leather and beadwork, and slowly began to understand the world William had grown up straddling, caught between cultures that both claimed him and both rejected him. One evening in late June, an old Shoshone woman named Bright Morning came to their cabin and spoke with William for a long time in their language. When she left, she touched Grace's face gently and said something that made William smile. "What did she say?" Grace asked after the old woman had gone. William pulled her close, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "She said you have a strong spirit," he translated. "She said my mother would have loved you. She said we're going to have a daughter, and she'll be a healer like you and her grandmother before her." Grace went still in his arms, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly, where she'd been suspecting, but not quite believing what her body had been telling her. "How did she know?" Grace whispered. William chuckled softly. "Bright Morning is a medicine woman. She sees things others don't. Is it true? Are we? Are you?" He turned her in his arms so he could see her face, and Grace saw hope and joy and something like fear in his dark eyes. "I think so," she admitted. "I've been too nervous to say anything, too afraid to hope. But yes, William, I think we're going to have a baby." The sound he made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then he was kissing her, his hands on her face, her hair, her still flat belly, and Grace kissed him back with all the love and joy and gratitude she felt for this life they'd built, for this man who'd saved her in more ways than one, for the Miley they were creating together. The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. Grace's belly began to swell with their child, and William became almost comically protective, trying to stop her from doing any heavy work, hovering whenever she climbed or reached for something. Grace bore his concern with patient amusement, knowing it came from love, knowing he'd lost so much already that the thought of losing her or the baby terrified him. They finished the cabin completely by August, added a small room that would be the nursery, built furniture and shelves, and made their house into a real home. Grace preserved food for winter, canning vegetables and fruits, smoking meat, drying herbs. William cut firewood until they had a mountain of it stacked against the cabin wall, enough to keep them warm through the harshest winter. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be, for the baby that would come with the first snows. Grace's father visited in September, making the long journey north with gifts and supplies and tears of joy when he saw his daughter's growing belly, when he examined her and pronounced her healthy and the baby strong. He stayed a week, helping William with the last preparations, teaching them both what to expect when the baby came, what to watch for, what could go wrong. Grace tried not to think about the dangers of childbirth, about how many women died bringing new life into the world, about her own mother, who died doing exactly what Grace was about to do. But William seemed to sense her fear, and at night he held her close and whispered promises that everything would be fine, that she was strong, that bright morning had seen their daughter healthy and whole, that Grace would survive this just like she'd survived everything else life had thrown at her. Dr. Hammond left reluctantly, making Grace promise to send word when the baby came, making William promise to take care of his daughter. And then he was gone, riding back to Stone Valley and leaving them alone in their mountain valley to await the birth of their child. October came with the first real cold, frost painting the meadow white in the mornings, the leaves on the aspens turning gold and orange and red. Grace moved slower now, her belly large and unwieldy, the baby active inside her, kicking and turning and making its presence known. William watched her constantly, his eyes following her every movement, ready to catch her if she stumbled, to help her up when sitting became difficult, to massage her aching back and swollen feet at the end of each day. Grace had never felt more loved, more cherished, more completely cared for. She tried to tell him once, tried to put into words what it meant to her, this devotion and care, but William just kissed her and said he was the lucky one, that she'd given him everything, a home and a family, and a reason to hope for the future. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but promised heavier storms to come. Grace felt the baby drop lower, felt her body preparing for the birth that couldn't be far off now. She wasn't afraid anymore, or at least not as afraid as she'd been. She had William, and she had Bright Morning, who'd promised to come when the time came. And she had her own knowledge and training as a healer. She would survive this. She had to. Their daughter was depending on it. The labor started 3 days later, in the middle of the night, during the first real blizzard of the season. Grace woke to cramping pain and the wetness of her water breaking, and she shook William awake with hands that trembled only slightly. "It's time," she said, and saw his face go pale even in the darkness. William was up immediately, building up the fire, boiling water, laying out the clean cloths and supplies they'd prepared. Grace labored through the morning as the storm raged outside, the contractions coming harder and closer together. And she tried to remember everything her father had taught her, everything she'd learned from assisting at dozens of births. But knowing the theory and experiencing the reality were two different things. And by afternoon, Grace was exhausted and hurting, and starting to feel real fear creep in around the edges. The baby wasn't coming as easily as it should. Something was wrong. She could feel it. And William's face showed his own terror even as he tried to hide it for her sake. Then Bright Morning was there, appearing at their door despite the blizzard like she'd known exactly when she'd be needed. The old medicine woman took charge immediately, checking Grace with practiced hands, speaking soothing words in Shoshone and broken English, telling her what to do and when. The baby was turned wrong, Bright Morning explained, breech position, which was why the labor was so difficult. But it could be fixed. She could turn the baby from the outside if Grace was strong enough to endure it. Grace gripped William's hand and nodded, and Bright Morning's hands were on her belly, pushing and manipulating with a skill that spoke of decades of experience. The pain was incredible, worse than the contractions, and Grace screamed into William's shoulder while he held her and whispered prayers in 2 languages. Then, something shifted. The baby turned, and suddenly, everything was different. The next contraction was productive, the baby moving down like it was supposed to, and Bright Morning smiled with satisfaction and said one word: push. Grace pushed with everything she had, William supporting her from behind, Bright Morning guiding the baby with capable hands. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, tearing and burning and consuming her entire world. But Grace bore down and pushed and refused to give up. And then, as the sun set and the storm finally began to ease, their daughter was born. A strong, healthy girl with a powerful cry and dark hair and eyes that would be blue-green like her mother's but shaped like her father's. Bright Morning cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft furs and placed her in Grace's arms. And Grace looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. William was crying, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and daughter, his family, everything he'd ever wanted and never thought he'd have. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "She's perfect, just like her mother." They named her Sarah, after William's mother who'd given up everything for love, and mourning for the woman who'd helped bring her into the world. Sarah, mourning, a name that honored both sides of her heritage, that spoke of new beginnings and hope, and the blending of 2 worlds. Bright Morning stayed with them for a week, teaching Grace how to nurse the baby, how to wrap her in the Shoshone way, sharing wisdom passed down through generations of mothers and grandmothers. Then the old woman left, promising to return in the spring, leaving them alone with their daughter and their joy, and the deep snow that would keep them isolated until the thaw. Winter closed around them like a cocoon, harsh and cold outside, but warm and safe within their cabin. Grace recovered from the birth slowly, her body healing, learning to be a mother to this tiny person who depended on her for everything. William was besotted with his daughter, holding her for hours, singing to her in Shoshone, teaching her things she was far too young to understand, but that he said anyway, because he wanted her to know where she came from, who her people were, what her heritage meant. The winter was long and hard, with storms that buried their cabin under feet of snow and cold that made the walls creak and the fire necessary day and night. But inside, Grace had never been happier. They were a family now, the 3 of them against the world, and nothing else mattered. William hunted when the weather allowed, checking his trap lines and bringing home meat to keep them fed. Grace cooked and cleaned and cared for Sarah, marveling at how quickly babies grew, how much Sarah changed from week to week. By January, their daughter was smiling. By February, she was laughing, a sound that made both her parents smile like fools every time they heard it. Grace's father managed to visit once, riding up on snowshoes in late February, with gifts for his granddaughter, and tears in his eyes when he held her for the first time. He stayed only 2 days, the journey too difficult and dangerous to linger, but those 2 days were precious. Dr. Hammond examined Sarah and pronounced her perfectly healthy, examined Grace and said she'd healed well, and looked at William with respect and gratitude for taking such good care of his family. Before he left, Dr. Hammond pulled Grace aside and told her that Luther Cross had been arrested. One of the ranch hands William had shot with an arrow had gotten drunk in a saloon and bragged about attacking the doctor's daughter on Luther's orders. Marshal Carson had finally had the evidence he needed, and Luther was sitting in the territorial prison awaiting trial. Grace felt something heavy lift from her chest, a weight she'd been carrying without fully realizing it. They were safe. Finally, truly safe. Luther couldn't hurt them anymore. Couldn't send men after them. Couldn't threaten their happiness. She shared the news with William that night, and she saw the same relief in his eyes, the same easing of tension he'd been holding for months. They made love that night, with a freedom and joy they hadn't felt since before the attack, celebrating their safety and their family, and the future that was finally, truly theirs. Spring came early to the valley that year, the snow melting fast, the meadow bursting into life with a profusion of wildflowers that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Sarah was sitting up now, fascinated by everything, reaching for anything within her grasp. Grace planted her garden again, expanding it this time, planning for a larger harvest now that they were feeding 3. William repaired the winter damage to the cabin, built a smokehouse and a proper chicken coop, talked about getting a milk cow when he went to trade in Stone Valley in the fall. They had visitors that summer, more than the year before. Trappers and hunters who'd heard about the couple living in the High Valley. Shoshone families who came to see Sarah and bring gifts. And once, surprisingly, a young couple from Stone Valley looking to homestead nearby. Grace and William welcomed them, helped them find a good spot 5 miles downstream, showed them how to build and plant and survive in the wilderness. It was nice, Grace thought, not being quite so alone, knowing there were neighbors within reach, even if not within sight. The young couple, John and Mary Peterson, became friends, visiting once a month, sharing meals and stories, and creating a small community in the wilderness. By the time Sarah's first birthday came around in November, Grace was pregnant again. This time there was no fear, no anxiety about what was coming. She knew her body could do this, knew William and Bright Morning would be there to help, knew their family was growing and strong and full of love. The second baby came easier than the first, a son born in April with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue-green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Grace's father, whose middle name it was, and Rising Sun for the time of day he was born. Thomas Rising Sun, a name that spoke of hope and new beginnings, and the bright future ahead of them. William cried again when his son was born, holding the tiny boy with hands that were infinitely gentle, and Grace watched her husband with their children, and thought she might die from the sheer overwhelming love she felt. They were a family of 4 now, their cabin full of life and noise and joy. Sarah was a precocious toddler, getting into everything, learning to talk in a mixture of English and Shoshone that charmed everyone who heard her. Thomas was a calm baby, easy and happy, content to be held or to sleep in his cradle while his parents worked. Grace managed the household and the garden and the children with a competence that surprised her, juggling responsibilities she never imagined she'd have back in her days as the doctor's daughter in Stone Valley. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Sarah turned 3, then 4, bright and curious, and already showing signs of her mother's healing gift, asking questions about plants and wanting to help when Grace treated minor injuries. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy, quiet like his father, happiest when outside exploring or helping William with the hunting and fishing. Grace's father visited twice a year, spring and fall, bringing news from Stone Valley and gifts for his grandchildren, and staying as long as the weather allowed. He told them that Luther Cross had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison, that the cattle ranch had been sold to pay his legal debts, that Stone Valley had quietly forgotten its judgment of Grace Hammond, who'd married a half-breed and chose love over respectability. There were even whispers, Dr. Hammond said with a smile, that she'd been right all along, that William was a good man, that they seemed happy in a way Luther's money never could have provided. Grace started taking medical calls again when Sarah was 5 and Thomas was 3, riding down to Stone Valley or to neighboring homesteads when someone needed help her father couldn't provide alone. William went with her when he could, leaving the children with Bright Morning or Mary Peterson, and people got used to seeing them together, the doctor's daughter and her tracker husband, working as a team to heal the sick and injured. Their reputation grew, spreading through the territory. People spoke of the woman who could set any bone and deliver any baby, and the man who could find anyone lost in the wilderness and track anything that moved. They became legends in their own right, the couple who'd defied society's rules and built a life of purpose and meaning in the mountains. Grace's skills as a healer deepened with experience and teaching from Bright Morning, blending frontier medicine with traditional Shoshone practices in ways that worked better than either alone. She taught Sarah what she knew, passing down the knowledge her father had given her, and watched with pride as her daughter showed real talent for the work. More homesteaders came to the valley over the years, drawn by stories of good land and friendly neighbors. A small community grew up, never large enough to be called a town, but big enough that the nearest families were within an hour's ride instead of a day's. They helped each other through hard times, celebrated together during good times, built a tiny schoolhouse where Grace taught reading and writing to all the children, including her own. William hunted for families that were struggling, taught the men tracking and wilderness survival, and slowly, gradually, earned the respect of even the most prejudiced settlers. His skills were too valuable to ignore, his character too solid to dismiss, and eventually, people stopped seeing him as a half-breed and started seeing him as just William, their neighbor and friend. The children of the valley grew up playing together without the prejudices of their parents' generation, and Grace thought maybe this was how the world changed, one generation at a time. One family teaching their children to see people instead of labels. Sarah turned 10, a lanky girl with her mother's healing hands and her father's quiet confidence. Thomas was 7, already able to track deer through the forest and handle a bow nearly as well as his father. And Grace, at 38 years old, looked at her life and marveled at how far she'd come from that terrified woman freezing in a blizzard. How much had changed since the moment William had lifted her onto his horse, and his hands on her waist had made her gasp with sudden awareness. They'd built something real here, something lasting. A home, a family, a community, a life worth living. One evening in late summer, Grace and William sat on the porch they'd added to the cabin years ago, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Sarah was inside putting Thomas to bed, reading him a story in her best teacher voice. The valley was peaceful, smoke rising from chimneys of neighboring cabins, the sound of the stream singing its eternal song. William's arm was around Grace's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart, the sound that had become synonymous with home and safety and love. "Do you ever regret it?" William asked quietly, and Grace didn't need to ask what he meant. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed in Stone Valley, married Luther Cross, had the easy life with money and status instead of this?" Grace was quiet for a moment, really thinking about it, then shook her head firmly. "Not for a second," she said. "Not one single second, William. This life, with you, with our children, with our community. This is everything I ever wanted, even when I didn't know I wanted it. Luther could have given me comfort, maybe, but never joy, never partnership, never this. She gestured at the valley, at their home, at the life they built together. You gave me freedom to be myself, respect for who I am, love that sees and accepts all of me. You gave me a life worth living instead of a life worth tolerating. How could I possibly regret that? William pulled her closer, his face pressed against her hair, and Grace felt him smile. I ask because I still can't quite believe it, he admitted. Can't quite believe I get to keep you, that this isn't a dream I'll wake up from. Grace turned in his arms, looking up at his face, seeing the love and wonder still there after all these years, and cupped his cheek gently. I'm not going anywhere, she promised. Not in this life or the next. You're stuck with me, William. Forever. They kissed as the sun set, still in love after all these years, still choosing each other every day, still grateful for the storm that had brought them together, and the courage it had taken to build a life against all odds. The next morning brought news that would change their peaceful existence. A rider came from Stone Valley, one of the young men Grace had helped deliver as a baby, now grown and working as a deputy for Marshal Carson. He brought word that Dr. Hammond had fallen ill, badly ill, and was asking for his daughter. Grace's heart clenched with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She packed her medical bag, kissed her children goodbye, and mounted her horse within the hour. William rode with her, of course, leaving Sarah in charge of Thomas with Bright Morning checking in daily. And they made the journey to Stone Valley in record time, pushing hard, stopping only when the horses absolutely needed rest. They reached Stone Valley 3 days later to find the town much changed from when they'd left nearly 11 years ago. New buildings had gone up, the main street was wider and better maintained, and there were faces Grace didn't recognize among the familiar ones. But the welcome they received was warm, people greeting them by name, asking after the children, expressing concern for Dr. Hammond. Grace rushed to her father's house and found him in bed, feverish and weak, struggling to breathe. Pneumonia, she diagnosed immediately, seeing the familiar symptoms she'd treated 100 times. She set to work at once, using every skill she had, every remedy she knew. Conventional medicine and Shoshone healing combined. William helped her, fetching water and supplies, holding the doctor down when the fever made him delirious, keeping the fire at exactly the right temperature for the steam treatments. For 3 days, Grace battled for her father's life, barely sleeping, barely eating, focused entirely on keeping him alive. William made her rest when she was too exhausted to see straight, fed her when she forgot to eat, and loved her through the fear and exhaustion with quiet strength. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Dr. Hammond opened his eyes, clear and lucid for the first time since they'd arrived, and smiled weakly at his daughter. You saved me, he rasped, and Grace felt tears stream down her face as she gripped his hand. You taught me everything I know, she said. I just gave it back to you. Her father recovered slowly over the next 2 weeks, regaining his strength day by day under Grace's watchful care. The town rallied around them, bringing food and offers of help, and Grace saw how much Stone Valley had changed in the years she'd been gone. The rigid society that had judged her so harshly seemed softened somehow, more willing to accept differences, more open to love that didn't fit their expectations. Or maybe Grace had changed, grown strong enough that judgment couldn't touch her anymore, confident enough in her choices that other people's opinions didn't matter. She thought it was probably both. Grace and William stayed in Stone Valley for a month, making sure Dr. Hammond was fully recovered before they left. During that time, Grace helped her father with his patients, teaching him some of the Shoshone techniques she'd learned from Bright Morning. And William tracked down a missing child who'd wandered into the forest, finding her safe and unharmed, and becoming a local hero in the process. On their last night in Stone Valley, the town threw them a farewell dinner at the church. It was a small gathering, just the families Grace and William had helped over the years, but it was warm and genuine in a way that meant everything. People thanked them for their service, for choosing to stay in the territory instead of moving east where life would have been easier, for raising good children and building a good life, and showing everyone that love was stronger than prejudice. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been one of the first to judge Grace all those years ago, came up with tears in her eyes and apologized. "I was wrong about you," she said simply. "I was wrong about him. You two have more love and happiness than most marriages I've seen, and I'm sorry I ever thought otherwise." Grace hugged her, feeling the last weight of old bitterness lift from her shoulders, forgiving fully and completely, because holding on to anger only hurt the person carrying it. They rode home to their valley with light hearts and full saddlebags of gifts from the town. And when they crested the last ridge and saw their cabin in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney and their children running out to greet them, Grace felt complete. In a way she hadn't even realized, she was missing something. The years continued their steady march forward. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman, skilled in healing and teaching, wise beyond her years. She chose to stay in the valley, to carry on the work her mother and grandfather had started, and eventually married a good man, one of the homesteader children who'd grown up respecting her and her family. Thomas, quiet and steady like his father, became one of the best trackers in the territory, working sometimes with the marshal's office to find lost people or track criminals, always coming home to the valley and the family that anchored him. Grace and William became grandparents, marveling at how quickly life moved, how the cycle continued. They watched their grandchildren play in the same meadow where their children had played, watched the valley community grow and prosper, watched the old prejudices die with the older generation, and a new, more accepting world emerge. Grace's father lived to see his great-grandchildren, spending his final years in the valley he'd come to love, teaching anyone who would learn about medicine and healing. He died peacefully in his sleep at 83, surrounded by family, having lived a full and meaningful life. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple marker that read, "Dr. Jonathan Hammond, healer and friend." Grace was 60 when the railroad finally reached their part of Wyoming territory, bringing with it more changes than anyone could have imagined. The wilderness became less wild, the frontier less front, and the world moved faster than it ever had before. But in their valley, life continued at its own pace, measured in seasons and harvests, births and deaths. The eternal rhythms of life lived close to the land. William's hair had gone fully gray by then, silver threads that Grace thought made him even more handsome than the young tracker who'd saved her life in a blizzard 32 years ago. Her own honey blonde hair had faded to white gold, and her hands, once smooth and delicate, were work-worn and capable. Hands that had delivered dozens of babies and healed hundreds of injuries and built a life from nothing. They were older now, slower, but no less in love. If anything, the love had deepened with time, matured like good whiskey, become something richer and more complex than the passionate attraction that had started it all. They knew each other completely now, had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had raised children and buried parents, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. One winter evening, much like the one where the story began, but so many years later, a blizzard swept through the valley. Grace and William sat by their fireplace, wrapped in furs, watching the snow pile up outside their windows. Their children were grown with families of their own. Their grandchildren were scattered across the territory. But it was just the two of them again, alone in their cabin, like they'd been at the beginning. "Do you remember the night we met?" Grace asked, her hand finding William's with the ease of decades of practice. "How you lifted me onto your horse, and your hands on my waist made me gasp." William chuckled, the sound warm and familiar as home. "I remember thinking I'd never felt anything as right as you in my arms," he said. "Even then, even in the middle of that killing storm, I knew you were going to change my life. I just didn't know how much. How completely." Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that was still there despite the years, feeling the steady beat of his heart that had become the rhythm of her own life. "Best decision I ever made," she murmured, "was choosing you. Choosing this life. Choosing love over everything else the world said I should want." William kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Best gift I ever received," he replied quietly, "was you trusting me enough to build this life together. You gave me a home, Grace. Not just this cabin, but a real home, a place to belong, a reason to wake up every morning grateful." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind. The kind that came from overwhelming happiness and gratitude for a life well lived. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance and the snow fall. Two souls so completely intertwined after 32 years that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the storm raged just like it had that first night. But inside, everything was warm and safe and perfect. The blizzard couldn't touch them here, in this home they'd built with their own hands, filled with memories of children's laughter and quiet mornings and passionate nights and everyday moments that had woven together into a tapestry of love. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed in the night. Grace woke in William's arms, just as she had for 32 years, and smiled at the familiar comfort of it. They rose together, moving through their morning routine with the ease of long practice. William built up the fire while Grace made coffee, the real stuff that the railroad made easier to get now. They ate breakfast together at the table William had built 4 decades ago, still solid, still serving them well. After breakfast, they bundled up and went outside to see what the storm had left behind. The valley was transformed, buried under 2 feet of fresh powder that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. It was breathtakingly beautiful, pristine and perfect. And Grace stood on their porch, looking out at the view she'd seen thousands of times, and still never tired of. "This never gets old," she said softly. William came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist just like he'd done so many times before. And Grace leaned back against his chest, feeling his warmth, his strength, his enduring presence. "No," he agreed, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "It never does." They spent the day clearing paths, checking on their animals, making sure everything had weathered the storm safely. In the afternoon, Sarah and her family arrived on snowshoes, bringing food and laughter and the chaos that came with 3 children under 10. Thomas and his wife came shortly after, and suddenly the cabin was full of life and noise and joy. Grandchildren climbed on William's lap, begging for stories about tracking wolves or finding lost travelers. Grace helped Sarah prepare dinner while catching up on valley gossip and news about who was courting whom and which crops had done well, and all the small details that made up community life. They ate together around the table that had somehow expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, passing dishes and sharing stories and laughing until their sides hurt. After dinner, the children played while the adults talked, and Grace looked around at her family, at the life she and William had created, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that she had to excuse herself for a moment to compose herself. William found her on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered valley in the twilight. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern in his voice, and Grace turned to him with tears streaming down her face and the biggest smile he'd ever seen. "I'm perfect," she said. "I'm just so happy, William. So grateful for everything. For you, for our children, for this life. For that storm 32 years ago that brought you to me. For every choice that led us here. I wouldn't change a single thing." William pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in the cold, holding each other while their family's warmth and laughter spilled out from the cabin behind them. "I love you, Grace," William whispered against her hair. "I've loved you since the moment I pulled you out of that blizzard. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." Grace held him tighter, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in his scent, feeling his heart beat against her cheek. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Forever and always. Now and in whatever comes after. You're my home, William. You always have been." The family stayed late, the children finally tiring and falling asleep in various corners of the cabin, the adults talking quietly by the fire. Eventually, Sarah and Thomas bundled up their sleeping children and headed home through the snow, leaving Grace and William alone again in the quiet cabin. They cleaned up together, moving in the synchronized dance of two people who'd worked side by side for decades, and then prepared for bed. Grace unpinned her white gold hair, brushing it out while William banked the fire for the night, and she watched him in the mirror. This man who'd aged alongside her, who'd been her partner and lover and best friend for more than half her life. He caught her watching and smiled. That same smile that had made her heart stop 32 years ago, and Grace felt warmth bloom in her chest. Some things, she thought, never changed. The love between them had only grown stronger, deeper, more essential with every passing year. They climbed into bed, the same bed they'd shared for 3 decades, and William pulled Grace close, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders, her hand over his heart. This was their position, the way they'd slept since their wedding night, and Grace had never felt safer anywhere else in the world. Outside, the night was cold and clear, stars bright in the winter sky. Inside, everything was warm and peaceful and right. Grace listened to William's heartbeat, steady and strong, and let her eyes drift closed. Tomorrow, there would be more work, more patience, more of the everyday tasks that made up their life. But tonight, there was just this, just the two of them, together in the home they'd built, surrounded by the love they'd created. And that was everything. That was more than enough. That was perfect. Years would continue to pass, seasons would change, children would grow and have children of their own, and the cycle of life would continue its eternal dance. Grace and William would grow older together, would face whatever challenges came with grace and courage and the strength they drew from each other. They would leave a legacy of love and healing and acceptance, would be remembered in the valley for generations as the couple who defied society to build a life of purpose and meaning. But all of that was still to come. Right now, in this moment, There was just Grace and William, two souls who'd found each other in a storm and chosen to build a life together against all odds. Two people who discovered that real love, the kind that lasts, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about choosing each other every single day, about partnership and respect and care, about building something together that was stronger than what either could build alone, about seeing each other completely, flaws and strengths, and choosing to love anyway, choosing to stay anyway, choosing to believe in the promise of forever, even when the world said it was impossible. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The wind whispered through the pines outside, and Grace and William slept, wrapped in each other's arms, in the home they'd made, in the life they'd chosen, in the love that had carried them through 3 decades, and would carry them through whatever came next. Because some things, the best things, the truest things, lasted forever, and their love was one of those rare, precious, eternal things. A love born in a blizzard, tested by adversity, strengthened by time, and lasting beyond measure. A love that had changed 2 lives completely and created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. A love worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth celebrating every single day. And as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead and the world slept under its blanket of snow, Grace and William held each other close. 2 hearts beating as one. 2 souls forever intertwined. 2 lives lived fully and completely together. And that, more than anything else, was the happy ending they'd both earned. Not an ending at all, really, but a continuation. A promise that would keep being fulfilled every morning when they woke in each other's arms. Every evening when they sat together watching the sunset. Every moment, large and small, that made up the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life they'd built. Together. Always together. Forever.